RAW and JPEG, what do they mean? Which is better? Hi and welcome to episode 91 of the Photography Explained podcast. I'm your host Rick, and in each episode I will try to explain one photographic thing to you in plain English in less than 10 minutes-ish without the relevant details. What I tell you is based on my lifetime of photographic experience and not Google. Episode 91 and I still can't remember the intro. It's a worry, isn't it? Before I go on, if you have a question you would like me to answer, just go to photographyexplainedpodcast.com/start. Right, here is the answery bit. RAW and JPEG are picture-taking formats. When taking photographs using RAW, no processing is applied to an image other than creating the image itself. When taking photos using the JPEG format, the RAW data is processed in camera at the time of image capture. JPEG files look better out of camera, but RAW files record more tonal and colour data, even if they do look rubbish. Okay then, so what does this all mean? And yes, we do need to understand this. Right, RAW. RAW is RAW. It doesn't stand for anything, it just means RAW. A RAW photo has had no processing applied to it, other than creating the digital image, that is. That's why it's called RAW. Blimey, a photography thing that makes sense. That makes a change, doesn't it? I'll soon fix that. JPEG stands for Joint Photographic Experts Group. Okay then, very quickly, this is a group of good folks who created the universal file format called JPEG. So that's where the term comes from, which is always good to know. And we should be grateful that they came up with such a universal digital image standard. And that's where we will leave those good folk, because to know any more will not help us with our photography. And that doesn't mean that I'm not grateful. I genuinely am. It's a wonderful thing, a universal format. We need more of them. JPEG is a good thing. So what is the difference between RAW and JPEG? Like I said, a RAW file is just the data that the camera records. A RAW file looks dull, flat and uninteresting. A JPEG file, on the other hand, looks brighter, sharper and more vibrant. This is because it has been processed in camera. Your LCD screen. Get this. When you take a photo and look at it on the screen of your camera, you're probably looking at a JPEG preview file. Oh, the irony. You take a photo in RAW and your camera shows you a JPEG preview. Now imagine your disappointment the first time you look at photos taken in RAW on your computer and they're nothing like the preview. But it's all fine, don't worry, once you got over that first shock. So what processing is done to JPEG files? It depends on the camera. Indeed, some camera makers have made a thing out of this in-camera processing malarkey. Fujifilm spring to mind as a company who give you lots of different film simulation modes amongst other things, but JPEG applies processing to the tonal range and colours and also compresses the files, making them smaller. So what are the downsides of JPEG? To be fair, it sounds great to me. Well, if you're happy taking photos in JPEG, then that is just fine. There is no stigma attached to this these days. Well, there might still be, but there shouldn't be. There's nothing wrong with it. The downside to JPEG is that the processing that is done in camera cannot be undone. And also the files are compressed, meaning that the file size is smaller, but data has inevitably been lost. Good use of the word inevitably there, which wasn't even in my script. But if you're happy with the look, feel and quality of the images you get, then great. And if you're starting out in photography, even better. So why would you choose RAW? Well, a RAW file has not been processed. Well, I say not processed, but there must have been some processing to convert the light that hits the sensor into a digital image. Now, this is not one for another episode. I could tell you, but the words that describe how this happens, but the words wouldn't have any understanding behind them. That was a good sentence, wasn't it? I could tell you the words that describe how this happens, but there wouldn't be any understanding behind them. That's better second time, isn't it? Not process means that the camera has captured what is there and not done anything with it. This is why JPEGs look great and RAW files look rubbish. With RAW files, we choose what processing is done to the RAW file. A RAW file has more tonal and colour data. This includes more data in the highlights, as in the light bits, and the shadows, the dark bits. Can anyone tell? Well, a RAW file processed properly has the potential to look better than a JPEG photo. A RAW file processed properly can create a higher quality image than a JPEG photo. But it really does depend on what you're doing with the photos. If all you're doing is taking photos and sharing them with friends and family, you're fine with JPEGs. Nobody would ever know or care. If you're working commercially, making money from photos, then you'll probably use RAW to give yourself the maximum data to work with. So what are the downsides of RAW? Well, you have to do the processing yourself. You need specialist software to be able to work with RAW files, as in Lightroom, Photoshop, Luminar. Others are available. RAW files are larger than JPEG files, and other people cannot open RAW files without specialist software. Anybody pretty much can open a JPEG. What do? I take photos in RAW. I process the RAW files in Lightroom. I export files out of Lightroom, and when I'm doing that, I convert them into JPEG files so other people can open them. The talky bit. Does this really matter? Like I say, it all depends on you. What are you using the photos for? Just to send to friends and family? Well, JPEG should be fine. Photographing weddings? You probably want to use RAW. Photographing buildings? I use RAW. The gap is closing though. A few years ago, RAW was much better than JPEG. And with developments in technology, there may come a point where it doesn't make any difference. We're not there yet though, but I suspect we're not that far off it. If all you want to do is take photos, tweak them a bit, and get them out there into the world, then that is different to high-end processing for issue of images to a client. Or just take photos and get them out there and let the camera do all the work. We assume that everybody wants to edit everything, but some people just want to take photos and get them out there, and that's fine. If you're not interested in learning how to process RAW files and are happy with JPEG, then you're fine. But if you want to produce the highest quality images you can and want to learn digital image processing, then RAW gives you the maximum data to work with. I just realised that a previous sentence didn't make sense. If all you want to do is take photos, tweak them a bit and then get them out there into the world, then that is different to high-end processing for issue of images to a client. I don't think I said that right, but there you go, we've corrected it now. And if you're not sure, you can take both. Most cameras these days give you the option to shoot in RAW and JPEG at the same time, which is pretty cool. And that's how I started off. When I didn't know what I needed to do, I did JPEG and RAW. I didn't know why I did it, I just did it. And what happened is that if you're going to do this, just look after your files and make sure that it's clear which are which and you don't delete one of one and not of the other. And what I did was, with the RAW files I had left, I eventually, well, quite quickly actually, having done the JPEG and RAW thing, I worked out how to edit RAW files in Lightroom, which isn't that difficult to be fair, and I enjoyed it. So all I did was delete the JPEGs. So shoot in both, and if you know which way you want to go, just delete the others and you're fine. Don't let this be a barrier to going out taking photos. If you're not sure, use both, and you can always delete the JPEGs if you get into processing RAW files, and if you do not, just delete the RAW files and you have lost nothing. But go out and take more photos. This is much more important. If you and I are not going out taking photos, there is little point in debating RAW or JPEG, to be honest, is there? Right then, there is a lot more detail I could go into on this one, but I didn't want to. I just wanted to make the point. JPEG and RAW are just different types of photos, different file types. RAW photos have no processing, JPEGs have some processing. You can use either depending on your preferences to take great photos, and you can take rubbish photos with either format too. It's not going to make the great photo. What you point your camera at is. Right, my one-line summary. RAW files are not processed. JPEG files are processed in camera. Choose your preferred format, and if you cannot decide, choose both and delete the one you don't want later. Related episodes. Well, the last episode was the reason for this episode, and that was Photography Explained Podcast episode 90. Do I really have to edit my photos? It depends, but mainly yes. Next episode, Photography Explained Podcast episode 92. Is editing photos cheating? Well, is it? Well, what do you think? You'll find out in the next episode, but here's the spoiler alert. No spoiler alert, you'll have to wait. Shout out. Well, this space needs filling, so get in touch and get your shout out on my ever-growing podcast. Apologies for the, it's a stumbling in this one. Just been one of those days for me. I'm done. Thanks for listening to my small, but not so perfectly formed podcast. To find out more about my podcast and do stuff to help me, check out photographyexplainedpodcast.com/start. Well, this episode was brought to you by caffeine, courtesy of Alta Rica Coffee. I've been Rick McAvoy. Thanks again very much for listening to me and for giving me 11.5 minutes of your valuable time, and I will see you on the next episode. Cheers from me, Rick.